When you say biomolecules here, these are macromolecules. That means these are big molecules. These are polymers that support life. Hence, you call it biomolecules. As you know, bio means life. Okay, so your biomolecules are polymers. That means these are chains of your monomers that support life. Now, from your warm-up, you've learned that there are 4 types of biomolecules, and these are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Now, all these 4 are very important because these are the molecules that keep us all alive, okay? So that's why we call them, again, biomolecules, because they support life. Now, we start with the first one that you have here. Okay, so the first biomolecule that we have is carbohydrates. Again, I'd like you to give your attention to the different monomers that they have. Again, when you say monomer, this is the building block of your biomolecules. Okay, so we just take a look at the monomer, the different types of biomolecules today, and of course, their different functions. We are going to dig deeper into the different types of biomolecules tomorrow. Okay, so again, when you say carbohydrates here, its monomer is a monosaccharide. Okay, so monosaccharide, or we'd also call this simple sugar. Okay, so this is a simple sugar. Now, your carbohydrate is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a 1:2:1 ratio. Okay, so the general formula for your carbohydrate is carbon, hydrogen with a subscript of 2. That means 2 atoms of hydrogen, 1 atom of oxygen, and closed in your parentheses with any number outside. Okay, so that means that for any number of your carbon and oxygen here will have the same number. It's going to be double that number for your hydrogen. Okay, so double the number for your hydrogen because the ratio is 1:2:1. So say in your example here, this is your glucose. Okay, so you have 6 carbon atoms. You also have 6 atoms of oxygen. And of course, you double that number for your hydrogen atoms. Okay, so you have C6H12O6, glucose, which is of course the sugar that is formed through photosynthesis in your plants. Okay, now another thing that is very important to note about your carbohydrates is that they are hydrophilic. Okay, when you say hydro, of course, as I've mentioned, hydro in science would mean water. Okay, so that means water. And philic means loving. Okay, so it loves water. It has no problem when, even if it comes into contact with water, it does not have any problem. Okay, so carbohydrates are water-loving molecules. They are made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen in a ratio of 1:2:1. And of course, your monomer, their single units would be called monosaccharide or simple sugar. Okay, so that's your carbohydrate. Now, as for the functions of your carbohydrate, this is the body's main source of energy. Okay, that's your body's main source of energy. Examples of food that are carbohydrates, of course, would be your bread, your rice, pasta. That's an example of your carbohydrate. Sugars that we have, soda, your chocolate. Okay, there's a lot of sugar there. Sugar, again, is carbohydrate. Okay, so that's the body's main source of energy. And so if you feel tired, if you don't have any energy, then you take in more sugar, or you take in rice, or you take in pasta or bread. Okay, so because they are very good sources of energy. Now, aside from that, they also form structural components. Now, some parts of this, or some examples for this, would be your cellulose. Your cellulose is the component of your cell wall, the plant cell wall, and it is an example of complex carbohydrate. It's a big type of carbohydrate. Another thing is your chitin. Chitin here is the exoskeleton. It is found in the exoskeleton, the skeleton of your insects. Okay, so the skeleton of your arthropods, of your insects, that's made up of carbohydrate, which is chitin. Okay, so again, the main function of your carbohydrate in the body is that it is the main source of energy. It may also have several other functions, like it forms structural components, the cell wall in your plant that is made up of your cellulose, and chitin in your exoskeleton, okay, the exoskeleton of your insects. Okay, you may also find carbohydrates stored in your body. Okay, in the bodies of organisms, you may have stored carbohydrates. An example for this would be starch in plants. Okay, so starch in plants, that component that you actually eat. Okay, whenever you're eating apple, whenever you're eating your mangoes, whatever fruits you're eating, that's actually starch that you're eating. Okay, that's carbohydrate that you're eating. Okay, so that's starch that is stored carbohydrate in plants. Okay, so that's stored carbohydrate in plants. All right, so these are some functions of the carbohydrates that we have. All right, now we move on to the next biomolecule that we have here, and that would be your lipids. Okay, so for your lipids here, the monomer, the single unit of your lipids are your glycerol, one molecule of glycerol, and two fatty acids. Okay, so one molecule of glycerol and two fatty acids, that would be the monomer, the simple structures of your lipids. Now, just like your carbohydrate, your lipids are also made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but the ratio for your hydrogen and oxygen are actually higher than 2:1, okay? The ratio, the proportion of your hydrogen and your oxygen atoms are not the same as the ones that you find in your carbohydrate. So because of this, your lipids are hydrophobic molecules, okay? They are hydrophobic materials, hydrophobic substances, which means that they don't like water, okay? So they are water-fearing molecules. Unlike your carbohydrate, which is hydrophilic, water-loving, your lipids are hydrophobic molecules, okay? So as you may notice, your oil and water don't mix, okay? They don't mix because lipids, your oil is an example of lipids, and they are hydrophobic molecules, okay? Now, as for their uses, as for the function of your lipid, just like your carbohydrate, it is also a form of energy. It is also a source of energy in our body, but this is a more concentrated form of energy, okay? If in your carbohydrate, you only get 4 calories per gram, okay? For every gram of carbohydrate that you take in, you get 4 calories of energy. For your lipids, you actually get 9 calories, okay? So 9 calories per gram. That means this is a more concentrated form of energy. And another function for this would be insulation, okay? So that means you don't easily get cold if you have lipids, if you have fats, since we have fats in our body. Okay, now another function for your lipids would be they also form structural components in our body. One very important function would be in your phospholipids. This is the cell membrane of the cells that we have in our body. Okay, so your phospholipids form structure in your cell membrane. And another thing would be in your steroids, examples in your sex hormones, testosterone, your estrogen. Your steroids are examples also of your lipids, okay? So these are several functions of the lipids that we have, okay? So again, it is a more concentrated form of energy. It is a reserved form of energy. So if you're tired, if your body needs energy, the first biomolecule that your body is going to consume would be carbohydrate. Okay, it's carbohydrate that your body is going to consume first. If it doesn't have carbohydrate anymore, then it is going to start attacking your lipids. Okay, so your lipids are stored energy, more concentrated form of energy, reserved energy in our body. They also function in insulation, and of course, they also form the different structural components in an organism's body. So cell membrane as part of your cell, steroids in your sex hormones. Okay, so again, that's for your lipids. For the third type of biomolecule that we have your proteins. Okay, so proteins here, your monomer is an amino acid. Okay, so amino acid, this is an example of this is the monomer of your protein. Now, there are 20 examples of, or 20 types of amino acids. So we have, some of them are called essential amino acid. The others are called non-essential amino acid. Now, basically, the difference is that when you say non-essential amino acid, our body has the capacity to make this. Our body has the capacity to produce non-essential amino acids. But when you say essential amino acids here, our body has no capacity to produce them. And so it is essential that we get this from the food that we take in. Okay, that's why it's called essential amino acids. It is essential that we get this from the food that we eat because they cannot be formed in our body. Okay, so again, the monomer of your proteins are amino acids. Now, the difference between the molecular structure of your proteins as compared to your carbohydrates and lipids is that if your carbohydrates and lipids only have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, your proteins would have nitrogen in addition and also sulfur. Okay, so in addition, it would have nitrogen especially. This is one determining factor that this is a protein, okay? If you are given in your EOC test, for example, you are given a molecular structure. You don't know what this structure is. And the question is, looking at the structure that we have here, looking at this illustration, what type of biomolecule is this? If there is no nitrogen, then that is not protein. Okay, if you see nitrogen in that structure, then that is a giveaway that tells you that it is actually protein that you are looking at. Okay, so these two other elements are added to your carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Aside from carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, again, your proteins would also have nitrogen, very important, and sometimes also have sulfur. Now, your hydrogen or your proteins are formed with peptide bonds. These are the special types of bonds that would form your proteins. This here is the basic structure of your amino acid. So whenever you have your amino acid, there is your carbon atom in the middle. This was part of your warm-up. There was a question there. What very important element is found in all biomolecules? All of your biomolecules would have carbon, okay, which makes them organic. Remember, in science, in chemistry, when you hear the term organic, that means it is carbon containing. Okay, so you have a central atom of carbon, you have your R group here, which basically is the one that changes, that would tell you the type of amino acid. The rest of the amino acid would have all these structures here. Okay, the upper structure, you'd all have this in your amino acid. It is only the R group that is going to vary. Okay, so that's only the R group that varies. So aside from the central atom of carbon, you have your hydrogen atom, you have your amino group here, which has, of course, an atom of nitrogen, and you also have your carboxyl group, which is COOH. So again, I repeat, your amino acids would only be determined by the R group here. This is the only part which is going to be changed in the different types of amino acids that you have. Now, this here is the simplest amino acid that you have. Again, when you say amino acid, these are monomers of proteins, simple structures of your proteins. So this here is the simplest amino acid that you have. It's glycine. And for its R group, it only has hydrogen. Okay, so again, I told you it's only the R group that changes. The rest of the things here, the rest of the structural component here for protein would be the same. So for your glycine, being the simplest amino acid that we have, it's only hydrogen here for its R group. Okay, so glycine is the simplest form of amino acid. Now, as for the structure of your protein, it has 4 different structures. Your structures here, these are very important in your protein because the structure would actually tell us what the function of your proteins are. So the 4 structures of the protein that we can have would be the primary structure. Primary structure would just be linear. You'll see this later in your tutorial. You also have the secondary structure, the tertiary structure, and of course your quaternary structure, the 4th structure that it may have. Now, the structures are very specific. As I've told you, as I've mentioned, the structures would tell us the type of function that the protein may play. Okay, the type of function that the protein may have would depend upon its structure. Now, the structures are very sensitive to heat. That's why we cannot have very high fever because, of course, all the enzymes in our body are made up of proteins. And when the structure of your proteins become denatured, when the structure becomes disrupted, then your enzymes would stop working. That means you are going to have a problem. It won't keep you alive, okay? So all these structures are very sensitive to heat, and so these structures can only work in certain types of heat or certain degrees of temperature. Okay, so again, enzymes here are types of proteins. And it's also very important for you to note that our body cannot store proteins. Our bodies cannot store proteins. And so it is very important that you have a continuous supply of proteins. What are some food sources that are very good sources of proteins? Meat. Okay, meat is a very good source of proteins. Your beans are good sources of proteins. Fish, chicken, beef, pork, these are all good sources of proteins. Okay, so meat is a very good example, a very good source of proteins. That's why going to the next slide here, some functions of your proteins is for growth and development. Okay, so growth and development, making of muscles, your proteins play a very important role there. That's why if you are going to the gym, if you want to build some muscles, if you want to be muscular, you need to be taking in protein shake. Okay, so protein shake, protein drinks, this is going to speed up the muscle formation. Okay, so because proteins play a very important role in growth and development. Also, it plays a very important role in the structure of our body. Actin and myosin here are 2 very important proteins that you find in your muscles. Okay, so these are the structural proteins that would make your muscles contract. that would make your muscles work. That's actin and myosin. Keratin here, this is a structural protein that you find in your skin, and also, of course, primarily in our hair. Okay, so that's keratin. You may hear this term or see this term in shampoos. Okay, so that's keratin. Now, of course, enzymes and hormones are also proteins. Okay, so again, as I mentioned, our body cannot store proteins, so continuous supply is very important. Okay, so that's everything for your proteins. Now, the last type of biomolecule here would be your nucleic acids. Your monomer for this would be your nucleotides. Now, when you say nucleotides, it is made up of three very important components. The first one would be your ribose sugar. When you say ribose sugar here, this is a type of sugar that has 5 carbon atoms. Okay, so a type of sugar that has 5 carbon atoms, that will be a ribose sugar. It also has a phosphate group and nitrogen bases, okay, or nitrogenous bases. We are going to study this tomorrow, okay? So we'll dig deeper into your different biomolecules tomorrow. For now, again, your monomer is your nucleotides made up of your ribose sugar, phosphate group, and your N bases or nitrogen bases. There are two main types, or there are only two types of nucleic acids. That's your DNA and your RNA. Now, the function is also dependent on the type of nucleic acid that you have. If it is RNA, okay, excuse me. If it is RNA, the function is in the making of proteins, okay? So RNA makes proteins, it synthesizes proteins. But when you say DNA here, it stores genetic information, okay? So your DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, that's the complete name for DNA. It stores genetic information, which actually is the reason why you look like your father, you look like your mom, or you may look like a combination of the two of them, okay? So it's because of the genetic information coming from your parents, and this, of course, is stored in your DNA. That's your deoxyribonucleic acid, okay? Now, to summarize everything that I've talked about today, again, you have 4 major types of biomolecules. When you say biomolecules, these are molecules, these are macromolecules, big molecules in our body that support life, that keep us all alive. Okay, so you have 4 types for this. You have your carbohydrates, your lipids, proteins, and your nucleic acids. Now, your carbohydrate, again, it's in the ratio of, you have your carbon, your hydrogen, and your oxygen in a ratio of 1:2:1. Okay, so that's 1:2:1. That would be your carbohydrate. Now, the monomer, the basic units of your carbohydrate would be your monosaccharide or simple sugar. Okay, as for the uses, we said this is the quick source of energy. It's also can be stored like your starch in plants, your glycogen in your animal cells, that's stored carbohydrate in your animal cells, which is glycogen. And also they form part of your structure. So cellulose, that's part of the cell wall of your plants. Chitin, which is part of the exoskeleton of your insects. Now for your lipids, you also have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but their proportion, the ratio is different from the ones that you find in your carbohydrates. So the major difference between your carbohydrates and your lipids are that your lipids are hydrophobic. They don't like water, okay? They don't like water, they don't mix with water. Now as for their monomer, your lipids are made up of 1 molecule of glycerol and 2 fatty acids, okay? So that's the monomer of your lipids. Some functions of your lipids, of course, they are stored energy, okay, more concentrated form of energy. Therefore, insulation, they keep us warm. They also form structures in our body. And of course, they are also found in our sex hormones. By structures in our body here, they are a very important component of our cell membrane, okay, the plasma membrane. Now, the third type of biomolecule that we have, again, would be your proteins. Now, aside from carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen here, you also have nitrogen, very important, and sulfur, okay? So added to your carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, you also have nitrogen and sulfur. The monomers for this would be your amino acid. We've talked about the different types of amino acid, essential and non-essential. Non-essential can be produced by our body. Essential cannot be produced by our body. Now, the uses of your proteins, of course, would be for cell production, for your muscles, and also for your structural components in your body, okay? Now, again, as I've mentioned, your proteins cannot be stored by our body, and so a continuous supply of protein is very important. What else? your proteins, your enzymes are also proteins, and so their structure is also very important. Once the structure is disrupted, your enzymes, your proteins would stop working. Okay, now the last type, of course, would be your nucleic acids. Your nucleic acids would have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen also, and phosphorus, okay, your phosphate group. Because its monomer would be your nucleotides, which is made up of ribose sugar, your phosphate group, and your N bases. You have two types for your nucleic acids. Remember, DNA and RNA. Your RNA is for protein synthesis. It's for making of proteins. And your DNA, of course, is for heredity. It passes on the genetic information from your parents to you. Okay, so from parents to offspring, that is through your DNA or deoxyribonucleic acid.